welcome, welcome, welcome. It is wonderful to see you. My name is Andrew Davis. It's my pleasure to be the director of the Edward Cadbury Centre for the Public Understanding of Religion in the Department of Theology and Religion at the University of Birmingham. It's my very great honour to chair the fourth and final one of this great series of Cadbury lectures that we have had in 2021. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us, and I'm sure that you, if you've been for the previous sessions, have been well rewarded already for that investment of time, and I know you're going to be equally entertained, enthralled and educated tonight in the fourth presentation. So thanks to you for joining us. It would have been slightly pointless having these lectures without you. We're really glad that you came. I should say, as this is the final session, an incredible thanks to Matt Cluley, the College of Arts and Law events manager, who's done an amazing job of helping with all the logistics, and to my co-chairs throughout this week, who've also done a fantastic job. But thanks above all go to Professor Linda Woodhead, who has delivered an amazing series of Cadbury lectures for us this year. I was just saying to her, they are the best attended Cadbury lectures of all time, slightly cheating because they're international online, but I'm sure they would have been amazingly attended either way anyway. So we're so grateful to her for taking the time. Linda is Distinguished Professor of Religion and Society at Lancaster University, and has overseen a number of major projects, written a number of major books that have changed the shape of the discipline of sociology of religion and massively influenced the direction of the study of religion in this country. I first met her, I guess, probably around about 9 or 10 years ago now, when she very kindly came over to Birmingham to consult on a project we were developing, which we still haven't got around to actually delivering yet. But her insight there and her kind of support and encouragement and the positivity and the engagement and the support that she gave us was hugely appreciated. And throughout this week, I've massively appreciated how she's managed to balance that enthusiasm and insight with critical rigour and positivity about what's been a really enthralling subject. So Linda, it's been amazing to have you with us this week. Thank you for such a tremendous series of lectures on values of the new religion. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you and ask you to deliver the fourth and final lecture for 2021 for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That's a lovely welcome and introduction. And thank you for inviting me in the first place to give these. It has been a treat for me as well. It's been wonderful to have such attendance. It's been wonderful to get all the comments. It has meant, however, that I've had to revise all of them continually, because you keep sending me interesting thoughts and ideas and examples. So it's been a busy week. Anyway, in this, the fourth and final one, I'm going to try and pull it all together and look at some of the big issues, draw together some of the sort of meta themes and conclusions from the previous lectures. I will share my presentation. Here we are. So the title of this final lecture is Culture Wars Revisited. And of course, I'm suggesting that the culture wars are really very helpfully thought of as value wars. Now, one of the things that I've been stressing, the starting point really for these lectures, is the new visibility of values. This word and also sets of values and value words are all around us now in a great swirling swarm, and I've been trying to illustrate that and see some patterns and coherence in that and explain why that might have come about. Well, I think one of the reasons that has emerged is that we start being values aware when things are up for grabs. That seems a good phrase for where we are now. It's got a sort of sense of a power grab, but also things are changing, and who's a moral authority has been changing very dramatically, as we've seen. So it's clear that we're currently in a time of moral transition. I would say that's definitely true of the UK. I think it's also true of the USA and North America and many other liberal democracies which have a Christian heritage. Now, I don't want to overplay this and say that it's, you know, the biggest moral transition or upheaval that society's ever seen or anything of that sort. I don't think I could possibly make such a claim. Perhaps we just go through cycles of, you know, moral transition and then moral stability, and then it quickly crumbles and you go through that in cycles. So maybe plus ça change, maybe what we think of as, you know, oh, it was all very stable and agreed in the past, and now it's suddenly changing. I suspect that's not the case, and that various crises, whether they're wars or rapid social change or whatever it might be, all lead to major ethical rethinking, but each one will have a very different profile. And the one we are in reflects our particular situation. Oops, going the wrong way. So I've been asking throughout why this transition at the moment and why the shape it's taking. And I want, in this concluding lecture, just to look at two aspects of it, which I think pull quite a lot of it together and are specific to this particular kind of values moment we're in the 21st century. So first of all, I want to talk about lost rituals, and then I want to talk about reaction against rationalism to explain why the values visibility and flux. So first of all, lost rituals, but in particular common rituals. I don't think we've lost rituals. I think there's a lot of re-ritualization going on around personal rituals and funerals and other things. But I think the overarching rituals that had a very important role in holding us together, and also in shaping some sense of good, I think that the loss of them has got to be factored in to why we're in this current kind of value situation. So we have, since the 70s, lost common liturgies, whether that's the Book of Common Prayer in the Anglican churches, or the King James Bible across churches. Maybe some would say the Latin Mass and liturgy in the Roman Catholic Church, and so on. We've lost these sort of common reference points and the embedded mores and values within those, and the moral stories of the Bible and so on, and the language of it. We've also seen, since the 70s or maybe the 60s, the decline of what Winston Churchill called county council religion in state schools. What he meant by that was that the 1944 Education Act, which is still partly in place, certainly where religion is concerned, it set up things we think have always been there, but they were really set in stone by that act, which was passed at the end of the Second World War in that setting, to try and create a post-war society that would be, would have what we'd call values cohesion. And how to do that? Well, they thought we'll use the churches, we'll use Christianity because it's a common culture, and so compulsory Christian worship assemblies every day. We've still got that in the law, but it happens less and less in practice. Compulsory RE in all state schools, and the dual system where you have church schools and state funding. We've still got all that, but often more in the breach than the observance, and it's certainly not a unifying factor anymore. Insofar as it is, it's values that are playing that role. So actually assemblies are much less likely to do Christian worship than they are to talk about one of the school values. And then we've seen the decline of, custom and practice type of rituals, like holding the door open and, those kinds of things. And those, of course, were very much tied up with a more hierarchical society in which, by gender and class and age, your role was set, and those rituals helped to stabilize and dignify those different, often unequal roles. Well, we've lost all of those because of a move towards much more egalitarian ethos. So that's a big social change, I think, the loss of those, and it plays a part in the moral change. I want to refer back now. Some of you may remember Mary Douglas, the anthropologist, and Basil Bernstein, the linguist. Douglas drew heavily on Bernstein, and they worked together as well. And she publicised, gave depth as well to the idea that he introduced of restricted and elaborated codes in speech, but she also relates it to rituals. Now, the restricted code is a kind of speech that works better when there's a lot of shared and taken for granted knowledge. So it's economical and rich, and you can convey an awful lot of meaning with just a few words or actions. So there's a sort of reservoir underneath it all of much that remains unsaid. But for this, you have to have a shared understanding. For those who belong to it, there's a sense of inclusion and a feeling of belonging. So, you know, it's a very tight code, and not much needs to be said. By contrast, an elaborated code spells everything out, because otherwise, you know, everyone's got to understand it, and there isn't that same body of shared understanding. You can't condense. And I would say that we're now all the time, most of the time, talking in elaborated codes. I mean, you can think of counterexamples like memes online, where small groups understand them and most people don't, and just a picture and a few words. But on the whole, because we're so much more pluralistic and there's so much less common culture and ritual and whatever, we're in elaborated codes. So I wonder if values, you know, are part of an elaborated code. Douglas was clear that rituals are part of a restricted code. They're really powerful condensed forms of embodied knowing and valuing. But articulated values, the visible values, the words, those fundamentals, I think that's to do with having to have an elaborated code around good and bad. Well, other things, of course, happened in the post-war period as well. I've talked a lot about the shaking of a hierarchical society, the way that various previously marginal groups have struggled to be more included, and sometimes we call that identity politics. I've talked about growing diversity. Mass education plays a part, and Bernstein and Douglas's theory would certainly say that what education does is promulgate elaborated codes. And democracy and populism, and the sense that we all should have voice and choice, and each one of us counts for one equally. And then the creation of digital space. So all part of the background as well of why values visibility. And on top of this, there's it's not just, it would have been very hard for religious institutions, and I do say that advisedly, not religion. I wouldn't say religion has failed to adjust, but the established religious institutions have failed to adjust. Andrew Brown and I wrote a book about the Church of England's decline since the 1980s called That Was the Church That Was. And our argument there is that the changes that came after the 80s, there were such enormous changes that have been extremely hard for any church to adapt to. But the leaders of the Church of England managed to not adapt particularly horrifically badly, or well, got too many negatives there, but you know what I mean. So failures of leadership and failure to respond to what was happening or even take it seriously. And I've also already mentioned in my first lecture, Derek Scally's lovely recent book, doing something quite similar, looking at the collapse of the Catholic Church in Ireland, and making a very similar argument, although his has got more to do with failure to deal with the growing abuse crisis until it exploded. So that's my first reason, main reason about why the values visibility. And here's my second, reaction against rationalism. So it's not just to do with changes in the ritual world and the religion world. I think it's changes to do in the more secular rationalistic world as well. This argument's much less often made. But in many ways, secularism is declining as well as institutional religion. And by that, I mean, by secularism, it of course means lots of things. I mean, more organized forms of atheism, particularly ones that are hostile to religion. So I think there's been quite recent reaction really against positivism. Everything's got to be empirically based and ideally expressible in numerically, that idea. And that's the only real knowledge. Nothing else is real knowledge. And rationalism's done itself no favours. I mean, rationalism does mean, as we saw in the last lecture, I'm taking Weber's sense, it's not just about scientific rationality, it's also about what he would call it the Geist, the spirit of the time, that everything's got to be arranged according to rational efficiency. So it's about corporations, organizations, bureaucracy. It's not just about a certain sort of epistemology and way of knowing. And that kind of rationalism has, it's done itself no favors. It's been seen as bossy, whether that's, I don't know, centrally planned town planning and all its failures, where people knew best how other people want to live, but it was called rational and efficient, or whether it's forms of bossy child rearing experts, or whatever it might be. And the reductiveness of it also has done it no favours. It's often been wrong. That doesn't help. Like child rearing theories, they just change all the time, or dietary theories, or what you should and shouldn't do. And self-serving expertocracies, in which of course you have to include university academics. There's a clear reaction against some of that, some aspects of how we have behaved. And so the idea behind a certain sort of rationalism, that this is value-free real knowledge, that idea, I think, we don't believe anymore. We can see there are values behind it. We can see that people's interests, scientific, even great science, its particular interests that drive it, and it's not value-free. We can see that, and we know it's not the only kind of knowledge. So this idea, I'm taking this as a kind of rationalist package here. We are really, we're really just selfish genes or DNA. We're really just animals driven by instinct. We're really just clusters of instincts, or we're hardwired, neuroscience. Oh, look in the brain and you'll find we're hardwired to X, Y, Z, whatever it might be. Buy handbags. Some of them are ridiculous, some of the things now that are meant to be hardwired. And similarly, though, because this is rationalism in its biggest sense, similarly, we're increasingly skeptical about the rationalist efficiency kind of knowledge that says, there's really no choice, there's no debate. We must drive up shareholder value, or follow the bottom line, or look at the numbers, or be realistic, and there is no alternative. And if you think there is, you're dwelling in cloud cuckoo land. Again, it's an epistemological strategy to say that one set of values have got to override another set. And we've seen through that, I think. I'm not saying it's not still very real struggle, but there's much more skepticism about it. So I think these are false fundamentalisms. Why should our biological instincts be any more fundamental than our moral sensibility? Why should shareholder value, it's a nebulous concept anyway, why should it be more fundamental to a corporation than its ethics? I say nebulous because the average share is held for something like 4 seconds, or that's being generous, I think. And instrumental rationality, why is that more rational than values rationality. And back to Max Weber again, he saw this. He made a distinction between instrumental rationality, which is what I'm saying we're reacting against, and what he called values rationality. And I love the idea of values rationality. There is such a thing, and it's a real sort of knowledge, and you have real arguments, and some are better than others, and there's evidence. So he saw there was a difference between efficient means and legitimate means. And there are serious ways of thinking and bodies of thought around in both areas. So in short, in answer to the why this, all the values phenomena I've been discussing in the previous lectures, why now? The declining authority of rituals and rationalism opens up a space and a need for more articulacy and debate and visibility of values, because we need them now to communicate and signal who we are when we can't take stuff for granted, to coalesce and find kinship, to navigate the world and the internet. You need something to help you, and to push back. There's power in being clear what your values are. Values have become a significant source of power as well as knowing. So that's my answer to the why, the values visibility, the puzzle that really started me off, that question, why all these values everywhere? That started me off on this whole lecture series and this whole quest. And that's my provisional answer. So next, in my summing up, I want to look at this whole area of culture wars or values wars, and why we're seeing this now, and what this has got to do with anything. And I think I've established that there is a values arena now, but is it necessarily a theatre of war? Well, it is certainly the case that the situation I've described is a volatile mix of things. So we've got this, the mixture includes the increasing diversity of values. So we all choose our own values, and they're powerful things. The deep personal identification that we increasingly feel with our chosen values, because they go very deep to who I am. So it's not just an intellectual debate to debate about my values. If I say that one of my values is equality, and you say, well, oh, that's great, but of course, women are not equal with men. I won't think, oh, that's interesting, let's discuss it. I'll feel personally challenged by that. Thirdly, the kinds of public fora or forums in which the debate or the war takes place, especially the online one. A lot of the brakes, B-R-A-K-E-S, on uncivility are taken off, and by things like anonymity, and with consequences we all know and can see. And a sense of responsibility goes. And then, and so does a sense of empathy that Adam Smith thought was absolutely at the heart center of the moral life, the ability to feel what someone else is feeling. Without that, you can't really be moral, he thought. And the entitlement to be heard and respected for who you really are, the live your life ethic that I've been emphasizing in every lecture as the new default personal ethic of our time. That is a really potent element in this volatile mix. So you easily get explosions, and you can see why when you've got all these things running along together in our culture, you're going to get regular explosions. This book I really recommend, Angela Nagel's Kill All Normies, Online Culture Wars from 4chan and Tumblr to Trump and the Alt-Right. it's a great read, and it's very illuminating about culture wars online. And she starts the book by talking about from Coney 2012 to Elevator Gate. And if you don't know what that is, well, Coney was, I spelt Coney wrong up there, but Coney was a documentary that it came to very quickly epitomize all that in the eyes of its opponents was completely flaky and nuts and just awful about liberal culture in America. It had sort of utopianism about the internet's going to join everyone up in the world, and there'll be one lovely peaceful community, what I called liberal progressivism. And it was focused particularly on disappeared children in, was it Uganda, I think, and how if we all unite, this is really Americans, we can change the world. So it drove non-liberals in the USA, particularly young ones, online. I mean, it was a kind of gift of, in their view, naffness. So that starts. So she said the point is, it starts with liberalism at a sort of high point of triumphalism, liberal values feeling that they just are indomitable on the internet, and that the web is going to just bring the liberal dream of all people around the world loving each other to fruition. The era begins with that, and then it ends with Elevator Gate. And that was, it all started in an atheist conference in Dublin, where Richard Dawkins, you can see in the blurry bottom picture, he was present. And someone asks why there are far fewer women than men at atheist meetings. There's an argument between Paula Kirby, saying she says nothing to suggest women are being held back in atheist circles, and Rebecca Watson says that Kirby's making an argument based on privilege and ignorance. But that's just the backstory. What happens next is that Rebecca Watson, at the end of this, goes into the elevator, to go back to her room in the conference hotel, and she's propositioned by an atheist man. So thereby just reinforcing her point, and maybe it was consciously aggressive because of what she was saying. And that's the beginning of Elevator Gate. Whose side are you on? And Richard Dawkins waded in with this really pretty dreadful post where he writes this pseudo letter pretending he's a Muslim woman telling Rebecca Watson to shut up and stop whinging about being touched in an elevator. So it's the pushback. The point is, it's the shift online from the triumphalism of the liberals to the pushback of the 4chan anti-liberal, Trump loving, some of them, kind of constituency that flourished on 4chan, on that platform. So it's also from Tumblr, which was a nice safe home for gender non-conforming people, for example, to 4chan, where you get this ranting anti-liberal, often anti-women stuff, the manosphere. So Nagel's conclusions in this is that this is another version, another episode in American culture wars, that the online has fueled those wars. Interestingly, she does appreciate and write very well about how it's not, as I said this in another lecture, it's not no ethics and badness against liberal values. It's people who think that transgression is good. That's what the 4chaners think. They love Nietzsche. They love the transgression of convention. So the liberals are the normies who don't, they haven't got the same sort of intellectual vigor. And it's also, she says, why it's still part of the same old culture war is that at its heart, it's still about equality, and it's still about gender equality. That's still the heart of all this, even with, Generation Z or Generation Z, even with these young men and women, nothing seems to change. So this is all referencing the classical culture wars thesis, which James Davison Hunter wrote about in this absolutely classic and brilliant text book, Culture Wars, well, not textbook, book, The Struggle to Define America. And he suggests that Pat Buchanan really set things going in the Republican National Convention when he said, there's a religious war going on in this country. It is a cultural war, as critical to the kind of nation we shall be as the Cold War itself. Pat Buchanan is part of the new Christian right, very conservative, fundamentalist Christian, very pro-family and traditional values. And it's really interesting that he uses the Cold War and the war language, and suggesting that this is what's taken the place of that war. And Hunter says that the culture wars are about gender roles in the family, with abortion being the symbol of all that, about the curriculum in schools and colleges, about multiculturalism, about religion being allowed a public place, and about the arts. And he was thinking about, sacrilegious images that were being publicly funded in the USA, that there was a lot of controversy about at the time. That part of the thing has faded. The other parts, not so much. But then there's a lot of questioning since Davison put that out about whether there really is a culture war. Alan Wolfe's book, One Nation After All, is, I think, the best critique of the culture wars idea. Wolfe did hundreds of interviews with Americans all around the United States, and his empirical findings contradicted the idea that there's a culture war. In fact, he found ordinary Americans have become more moderate than their leaders. So political and media leaders are much more extremist culturally than ordinary people that he talked to. So he says the culture war, it's there, but it's more in the minds of journalists and activists than ordinary Americans. And in a later article, he points out that in the 2004 election, abortion wasn't a big issue. Gay marriage did divide opinion, but opinion's been liberalising, and it has liberalised more since. And the Terry Schiavo case, which was about euthanasia, was meant to rouse emotions of the Republicans, but it didn't. It failed to. So he says that actually, insofar as there is a culture war, it runs through all of us. We all find ourselves, most people find themselves a bit divided. So he'd say, like, most Americans are in this middle band. Maybe it's a spectrum. At one end, you've got the real out and out, Republican kind of camp, really fiercely culture wars, new Christian right, and so on. At the other end, you've got really out and out liberals. And in the middle, you've got most people on a spectrum. So the culture war is more a kind of rhetorical trope, a way of politicians drumming up support and the media getting eyeballs or whatever. And he also pointed out, this is Davison, who wrote a later book called Before the Shooting Begins, rather worryingly, I'm thinking about the Capitol, 1994. I mean, he did point out it's not really a war. People aren't actually shooting each other. And he also pointed out that the progressives, the liberal progressives, are dominating the cultural institutions in America, but increasingly the conservatives are dominating politics. And he was quite optimistic, and still is. He thinks that liberalism is about compromise. So the fact that the USA has got these culture wars shows that, it's an open society, and it's historically got very good means of holding together difference. He's quite optimistic in that way. I'm not sure it's so different in Britain. I mean, we don't have a culture war in the same way for various reasons, including we haven't got that we have got sort of bipartisan. We've got a bi-party system. That's another question. But the issues haven't, the culture issues haven't gone down party lines. So it was the Conservatives who brought in gay marriage and other liberalising legislation, for example. So it's not as stark in the UK. Despite all the talk in the Telegraph and the Mail, in the right-wing press about wokeism, and the wanting to build that up into a big culture war. I mean, that can happen, but it's not quite there now anyway, not yet. And here's just some recent British opinion to show that it's a bit like what Woolf found when he talked to actual people in America, when surveys ask opinion of people in Britain. Few people think that efforts to increase equal opportunities have gone too far. They're pretty supportive of equality legislation, but there's not much appetite for more. Most people do think that a transgender woman is a woman and a transgender man is a man, but they don't think it's easy. It should be easier to change their legal gender. That might be an opinion that shifts quite quickly. Half of British people support the Black Lives Matter movement, but 2/3 think statues linked to slave traders should remain on display. So yeah, they're more complex positions, and opinion does change. And it's been going in a liberalising way on those issues. Nevertheless, culture wars or values wars are a constant possibility because of that volatile values arena I've talked about and all the factors I've been talking about in these lectures. They're much worse when you get a binary choice. That's why the Brexit referendum, as I was talking about in the last lecture, quickly attracted this polarisation. Media and dog whistling stokes it up, plays on it, makes it worse. And so do values fundamentalists, and I'm about to come on to them in my final bit. I think the real issue here, as we think about the future, is how entrenched does one of those wars become? Does it sort of fade away? I mean, we can ask that in relation to the Brexit polarisation. Is that over and done with now? And will it fade away? Or will it just sink into the sediments and then something else will come along and it'll all come up to the surface again? But this time it'll get another layer put on it and it'll become culturally even more salient, and so it goes. This is an open question, and people have got agency about the answer to this question. And just to point out, there are still a lot of shared values and crises bring them out. 9/11 brought it out in the USA. Differences were suddenly forgotten. COVID has brought it out in many countries. And the NHS is our shared value system symbol. Okay, finally, I need to sum up finally about my overall title, which is Values Are the New Religion, a bold assertion, and see why I think that and what it actually means. The important thing here is to look at our presuppositions and the fact that whether we're Christian or post-Christian, the idea of Christianity still in a Christian heritage country still frames what people think religion is. But actually Christianity is quite unusual as a religion in that it has what the historian of early Christianity, Peter Brown, calls a compact constellation of spiritual experience, rituals, community, beliefs, values. Brown thinks this explained part of its success as a religion because compared with Greek and Roman religion of the time, they didn't put all these things together in a package like that. They didn't have a one-stop shop of religion, which Christianity became. And that, Christianity, I think, has got baked into the way we think about all religion in a way that is misleading. So a lot of sort of classic definitions of what all religion is, what religion in general is, like Emil Durkheim's famous definition, bake ethics and values into religion. So Durkheim says religion is a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things, which unite into one single moral community called a church, all those who adhere to them. Now, part of the reason for saying this by Durkheim and others and insisting that religion has to have values or it's not religion is to try and keep a clear boundary with magic. But that itself is a Christian instinct, to want to do that. Why do that? I think it's got to do with my second reason here. It's a very colonial approach to say that magic is kind of a part of a primitive. It's a colonial evolutionary Enlightenment view. You know, primitive religions had magic and no values, and civilizing religions, particularly Christianity, is a values-based religion, therefore it's better. And it's part of modernity, not like those primitive religions. We've still got that idea in our head somewhere. But if you look at not just ancient Greek and Roman religion, but a lot of Hinduism, vernacular religions in the West and in the rest of the world, ordinary everyday religious practices in China, folk religion it's sometimes called, you know, they haven't necessarily got much to do with values, if anything. And the mythology is certainly not a moral exemplars, a lot of the gods and goddesses and what they get up to. And it's also true that I think all big religions anyway are themselves, even if they've got values baked in, they've got enormous range of values. And if you look at a very modern religion, which the revival of heathenism or asatru, which we saw in things like the storming of the Capitol, with the shaman there and the Charlottesville riots, you know, heathenism and asatru is a revived religion with Nordic mythology, but it goes right from the far left to the far right in its values. And yeah, so it doesn't have to be one value set in a religion, even if it has values. So I think that perhaps in some ways in modern times, religions got overwhelmed by values, or certain ones did, for all those reasons. Fundamentalism, which is a kind of modern religion that develops at the start of the 20th century, is a very, very saturated with values. In some ways, it's kind of sacred values, particularly about, you know, and I think there's only one set, which is called traditional values, or the Hindu family, or biblical marriage. You know, there's only one set of fundamental values and truths. Very modern view. But even something like, I mean, it's not all more on the right wing. Quakerism in some of its forms, where you strip out the experience and the ritual parts and community parts, is not the community parts, sorry, the ritual and experience parts. Quakerism is very much about values, and I showed you their value statement. And to be a good Quaker is to be peaceful, live a simple life. You know, many Quakers would say, including Hugh Rock, who I mentioned, that is Quakerism. It is a sacred way of life. And also I've talked a lot about liberal progressivism and how that side of the culture war comes from progressive universalist Christianity and the social gospel. And that was really Christianity with a lot of the religions stripped out and the values left in and really emphasized. I mean, if you go to a church and you hear a sermon about human values, materialism's bad, we've all got to love each other, that's values. That's just a values statement. So we've ended up, in a funny way, both on the religious and the secular wing, with values. And particularly, unfortunately, a kind of values fundamentalism very often. And here are the telling things about how you can tell when it's there, value fundamentalism. And it can just as much be in, you know, organisation or a school or secular values as religious ones. You get the language of absolutes. Well, these are absolute values. We can't question these. And people who do are relativistic or pick and mix. They're kind of insulted. You get ethics reduced to a small number of values, fundamental slogans. And you get for us or against us thinking. So it's affirming, I should say, a cookie cutter cluster. You get, the clusters. I've got my cluster of values, and if you don't share them, you just project all anti-values onto them. And increasingly, you get moral excommunications. That's what that concept of cancel culture is worrying about. So to finish off, so what? So what? What's the kind? What does it matter? And what are the takeaway messages from all of this that I've been trying to think through and explain? Well, the ones that come to me are these. First of all, and I learned this from a social psychologist of fundamentalism a long time ago, if you're talking to fundamentalists, this is talking about research, religious fundamentalism, never engage head on, because they want you to. People who've got a binary way of thinking want you to oppose their values, because it reinforces their idea that there's just these two sets. And it will get you nowhere. And you can see this on Twitter. It's absolutely pointless to engage in a debate with a values fundamentalist of whatever kind. Instead, you should search for shared values. And that will often you can often reframe the things or come at it in a different way. And if you do have these conversations for long enough, you'll find, say somebody, let me give you an example. Say someone is very fundamentalist about the family and says, it's the biblical family, that's what being a Christian is, living in a patriarchal family. I don't agree with that. I don't think that's what the Bible says. I don't think, nor do I think that's a fundamental value. But if I say that you're wrong, I'm not going to get anywhere. If I go off on a different tack and we have a really interesting conversation, I may find out the reasons why they so value the family. They may have had a lovely, warm, important upbringing, and they want the same for their children. And then maybe I could explain that, well, it's not the same for me and many other people, or for example, maybe the conversation can go in a more constructive direction, because there will be some common values somewhere, more than likely, if they're interested in values. And I think the other issue is, where can we have those conversations? Do we actually have spaces or time for them in our society, and where? And a hint, don't do it on Twitter. It's not the place. My so what also takes me to the bigger picture. And I would say that in all of this, it's really useful to think about all groups, whether it's the family, my family, or an organization, or the whole of society. All of those have three options when it comes to values and how we deal with them. You can seek for value cohesion. We'll have a value statement and everyone needs to sign up to it. You can indulge in a values war, and that often flows from the cohesion direction, because if you don't agree with those values, you're going to fight against your enemy and feel very threatened. Or you can have a genuine values pluralism, and that is what I would like to commend. Just to go through them again, values cohesion, what they look like in practice: establish our values, have our very clear value statement, treat them as fundamentals that you can't disagree with or debate. You can have a value war, and you really reinforce those, show strong leadership, fight against then you create a moral majority and a moral minority. Or you can have a values pluralism, and it doesn't have to mean relativism, nor does it have to mean we're going to exist in completely parallel lives. What does it mean? Values pluralism, philosophically, means there are many fundamental values or principles, but they're ultimately incompatible. You can't maximize them all equally. They start to clash if you try, like liberty and equality. They will come into contradiction with each other if you push them both at the same time. And there is no unifying higher good. There is no blueprint for society in which it's all the highest good is going to be realised simultaneously. And also, quite tragically, this is moral tragedy, there is often no answer to a moral dilemma. And we find ourselves in situations where whatever you do is wrong. There is not a right answer to a lot of situations. There might be a better answer, but there isn't a right answer. Just put down Berlin and Williams as people who write very interestingly about this position and defend this position. Now, you can develop that into a fuller version. I'm not going to do that, actually. That's a whole moral theory. I won't do that now, but it might come into the discussion because I've run out of time. A few practical implications of what it would mean to go down a more value pluralist route in society. I think it would mean at least these things in Britain. It would mean taking more seriously understanding values and their histories, including those we think are ours. You know, if these are our school values, well, where did they come from? They didn't just come out of the sky. So where do they come from? What's their history? That enables you to see them in a proper perspective. Or liberal values. They're not just the truth. I think there should be more teaching about values in schools. We've discussed that in the Q&A, and I think that ought to be in the RE curriculum as it develops. And I think we need to develop better skills for how we discuss values, how we discern what are the real operative lived values, not just the stated ones. I've talked about research techniques like the ones that Stephen Patterson has pioneered. And there has to be more debating, disagreeing, learning. Because the interesting thing about the ethical life and values is that there aren't any people who are better at it than others. And we really are all in this together. So thank you very much for attending. Thank you for listening. And thank you for those of you who've offered fantastic comments and Q&As. It's been a journey for me. I hope you've enjoyed the journey. And thank you very much for sharing it.
Thank you so much, Linda. It's been a fitting conclusion to a fantastic series and some really exciting and insightful observations there. And lots of people are already asking you things about what you've said in the Q&A box. So just to give Linda just a moment to catch her breath, if there are questions that arise as you're reflecting on what Linda's been talking about this evening, do type them into the Q&A box. The advantage of using the Q&A is we can get people to upvote you. So if people see your question and think, oh, I wish I'd thought of asking that, or that's a brilliant question, or I'd love to see Linda answer that, then they can just kind of tick the thumbs up and upvote you. So please do that, and we'll go in order of upvotedness of the questions in the Q&A box. The couple of comments that have come through the chat as well, we're seeing those. I mean, there's one short technical question that's come through in the chat that maybe I'll ask you first, Linda, if that's okay. Just referring to some of the data that you talked about earlier, and somebody's asking, how do you come to the conclusion that only half the British population support Black Lives Matter? So maybe you want to just pick that up first.
Yeah, that's an easy one. It wasn't my conclusion. I was citing a poll without going back. I can't tell you what poll that was, but on the recording you'll be able to see there's actually a click through. I'm not sure you'll be able to use that, but the poll is there, and that was a poll a couple of years ago. Maybe it's changed since then.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, so let me head over to the Q&A then in that case. And the first question, top of the league table, is from Luann Gavreau. And Luann says, now that most people are not hearing Sunday sermons, which at their best remind one of Christian messages and encourage taking them into the weekday world, where do people go to have their values regularly reinforced and reinvigorated?
Gosh, that's going to make me think. Well, recently, Unforgotten on the telly, and and what was it? What's the other one, Andrew? What's the other really popular detective one recently that
You
came
mean
to the end?
Line of Duty?
Line of Duty. Thank you. Line of Duty. I mean, I think these are moral dramas, and in Line of Duty, you're cheering on the guy who's anti-corruption and pro-truth, aren't you? And he's such an admirable moral character, and he's going to stand up to these awful corporate police people and the corruption. But the corporate, I mean, I quite like the ending. I know I'm the only person, but the point was, it's not just these dreadful organized gangs that we can all say are terrible. It's your average corporation. It's the police. It's the BBC. It's the corruption in the heart of all those sort of organizations. That's the problem. That's a moral drama. I was applauding that at the end and feeling encouraged by that, and equally by Unforgotten, which is about sort of righting wrongs. It was about redemption and people chasing the truth and justice to put things right. So I think that's a very small part of the answer. I'm going to think more about that. If anyone's got any suggestions, put it in the chat. Where do you find your moral and values inspiration?
Do you think part of the challenge is that sometimes people go to Twitter to get those values reinforced, and that's kind of not a helpful way forward, perhaps?
Yes. I mean, certainly the internet. Some sites. There's some sites. There are a lot of sites, social media sites, are support sites. And when you set up a chat room, that's often a mutual support sites, and some of those are incredibly helpful for marginal groups or people with particular illnesses or whatever it might be. But 4chan's a support group for well, I won't say rude things, but the mob, it can be a mob thing where you're kind of egging each other on to do something more outrageous than the other person, and giving votes for being particularly on message, even if it's not a very nice message. So it's a mixed blessing, I think, Andrew.
Thank you. So let's turn to another question from John Waters then. And John says, what is the impact of the weakening in integrity of some of the shared public regulatory rituals, that's quite hard to say, public regulatory rituals, shared values in brackets, that used to be supported cross-party, e.g. independence of civil service, number of permanent secretaries that have been sacked seems unprecedented, weakening of regulatory behaviour of politicians, e.g. resignation of government advisor on bullying findings, resignation of chief legal officer, disregarding of shared unwritten constitutional rules, etc., etc., and a few other examples that John gives. So are those kind of things undermining our shared value in the integrity of the national political process?
That's a really interesting question, because it goes to the heart of what I was saying about, do you want to emphasize cohesion and these common things, that are value neutral, like the civil service ideology, or politically neutral anyway, or do you want to allow more values pluralism and therefore clear signalling of what values are in play here? I mean, I can see the arguments for both. I came down on a pluralist side, but you need a certain amount. Every society needs cohesion, or it's going to end up in civil war. That's not. I mean, that's a widely shared understanding. But what's not shared, and it's a really interesting question, is whether we achieve sufficient cohesion. You can achieve that through pluralism and by having just enough kind of enough referees around to regulate the playing of the game. In which case you absolutely need the sorts of people that John is talking about there. But the sorts of people he's talking about there, at the worst, they can become the kind of we're values-free rationalists and we're above, we float above everything. So, yeah, that's my thoughts on both sides of that debate.
Super, thank you very much. A couple of people have commented on the reinforcing your values comments. So
Oh
just
yeah.
feed those back to you. So Helen, just scrolled off the bottom of the page. So Helen says, I think Facebook does it. Facebook is set up to give you more of what you read and reinforce your values, and it works
Mm,
so
mm,
it's the whole algorithm question, isn't it? There, I guess, really.
mm.
Somebody else, Chris Steed, has put reinforcing your values becomes a question of where your view of the world can be reinforced. So there seems to be that suggestion that people go to places that reinforce their own position. Although it's interesting, intriguing to me that you first of all went to the drama, and it's interesting to think
Mm.
how drama and television, the media, have shaped attitudes and motivations. You started off on Monday making reference to. I nearly said Mary Nightingale. I mean Mary Waterhouse, and some of the kind of issues back there. In a sense, she was right that the kind of media has influenced values over the 40 years or so, wasn't she?
Yes, she was, wasn't she? Um, she feared it and what it was going to do to values. So not sure that all her, I mean, well, some of her fears have come true. Pornography, certainly. I mean, she'd say that everything she predicted came true, wouldn't she? Um, and that's a whole other topic that I didn't get onto. But yes, maybe you're right, Andrew. Maybe that is the case. Yes. But I like these comments. Facebook, yes, and hashtagging things. That's a way of gathering together certain interests and groups, and social media platforms. Some of them are good at gathering together in common values.
Mm-hmm. There's some really nice praise in the comments as well. Karen's saying wonderful lectures. Stephen's saying great series, really enjoyed it, bravo and thank you. Ian saying very thought-provoking, I look forward to seeing the book. So kind of high praise indeed from our colleagues in the chat. But let's go back to the questions then. So Helen says, what connection, if any, do you see between this questioning of values and the globalization of the economy with the development of new winners and losers?
I know Helen, and she always asks really difficult questions that go to the heart of things, and this is one of them. I think she's obviously onto something. There is some connection here, and our sense that the globalization of the economy it's a kind of trigger issue, and it was a trigger issue in the culture wars. Those who thought globalization was wonderful and was going to lead to more human international cooperation, and those who saw globalization as having terrible consequences, including for the economy and people's lives and inequality, and the 1% getting richer and everyone else getting poorer. And so it goes, that whole issue is absolutely the heart now, I think, of a kind of culture war issue. So yes, it has absolutely, I should have mentioned it, it's got something important to say to all of this.
Okay, thank you. And Kay Kitching at Beham picks up on that kind of global issue really in a sense and says the problem here may not be as stark as the US, but is the fabrication of a freedom of speech problem in UK universities not further evidence of how effective government stroke conservative politics has been at gaining institutional wins?
Yes, I think yes to that. Conservative policy has been very good at seeing where the values direction is going, and in that case, just legislating on something that was being aired very widely in the more right-wing press as a problem. So yes to that.
Okay, thank you. Really interesting question from Andrew Brown here, and he says, when was the last big binding ritual? Was it the rites for Diana's funeral?
Clap for carers.
Absolutely, yeah, no, I like that. And it's interesting. Diana's funeral was a a public funeral like no other in many ways, wasn't it? But it's interesting to see how those big royal events in different ways that we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years have had a national effect. So there were, of course, 100,000 people united in their antagonism about the coverage that Prince Philip's death received on the BBC, and that was covered kind of well in the press. So there are clearly people united against such rituals or such coverage, but those kind of events do still catch in the national imagination. Still have
they completely do. You know, I would say that we've got we have a national theatre or a national pantomime, and that's an answer to that early question about where do we reinforce our shared values and our value differences. I think we use the royal family. I think they're absolutely essential in our national pantomime, and we use them both to reinforce common values, but also to think through our values disagreements. So, you know, Meghan and Harry versus the rest of the royal family. I mean, that's absolutely about a certain sort of live your life ethic versus a give your life ethic. So they're absolutely fantastic for thinking about values, and sometimes in a polarizing way and sometimes in a unifying way.
And it's interesting that the clap for carers goes back yet again to the kind of archetype of British values in the NHS as well, doesn't it? So the NHS has been another recurring theme that we've kept going back to.
It is, because it's a fantastic shared sacred symbol for cohesion. I mean, there are bad things about having a really effective unifying symbol, which is that you can't criticise them and talk about their inefficiencies and problems. And when we have terrible scandals and murderous nurses and doctors, we have to sort of bury it and not think about it. But or as Stephen Patterson's research shows, you know, we have to sort of bury the bits of the NHS like bullying that we don't want to talk about. But going back to Andrew's question, Diana's funeral was also a bit polarizing. I mean, some people just called it mass hysteria. Some of us were crying our eyes out for days, and some people called it mass hysteria and utterly trivial. I happened to be at a conference on Christian ethics, Andrew, when it took place, the televising of the funeral. And if Ian Torrance is still listening, I think he was there too. And you know, it took part right just in the plenary. So some half of the conference went to watch the funeral, and half were meant to be in the plenary, and it caused a complete polarization of the ethics conference.
It was remarkable in that it really did reveal a kind of change in British society. But a few weeks before, you wouldn't have imagined that such public declarations of affection and emotion would have been commonplace, would you really? So
it was my first book I ever put together. It was edited with some colleagues. Was called was it called the Religion of the Heart or something like that? And it was about Diana's death and mourning. And I wouldn't call it that then, but now I would say, and I was trying to think about what this was signalling, and I was sort of onto that. It was a values shift. So I think this was early sort of live your life values that she exemplified. You know, whereas Charles and the Queen, they exemplified cold-hearted, sacrificial, you know, repressive. So we definitely think through the royal family, but Diana was the beginning of the live your life ethic, and that's why a lot of us loved her.
Excellent. So Darian Q, just picking up on that earlier discussion, says, I agree, Twitter is not the space for having these value discussions, but there seem to be fewer and fewer common spaces to have those conversations. Any idea how we can carve those spaces out in today's society?
Oh, I wish I did. Yeah, that's one of the questions I'm left with. And I don't have the answer. I mean, I would love the teaching of RE, because I'm very passionate about the teaching of religion being incredibly important and a wonderful opportunity, and something that's a gift in this country because it's compulsory in all schools. I do have a lot of interest in how that goes. And I think that's one space. But once you've left school, I mean, universities have a very I don't think they've thought this through enough, Andrew, to be honest. And are not good spaces for it. And they've sort of fallen for the value-free kind of myth as well. And they're struggling to cope with value conflicts at the moment. And I mean, the internet, as you say, isn't great. So where does it happen? It's a real challenge for our society, I think.
Is it exacerbated by the kind of marginalisation of religion, if such a thing is indeed happening?
Possibly. I mean, that assumes you think that religion was good for having these disagreements. And actually, I think that in some ways it was. You know, when you have a very broad church of whatever kind, you got, I mean, that's part of the strength as well as the weakness of the Church of England, but actually also the Catholic Church and the Church of Scotland, that they were able to hold together a whole range of views, and they've stopped being able to do that now. The value fundamentalists have taken over.
There are a couple of comments around value fundamentalism in various forms, really. So Chris Lord says, is combating climate change a question of values or of scientific facts? Stephen Patterson makes a comment quite similar in many ways in the context of populism and vaccine resistance, which just disappeared from my screen the moment I started reading it. So climate change, vaccination, populism in those regards, are those questions of values or of science? And does it matter in some ways?
It's obviously a scientific, empirical basis to the worry about climate change and thinking about its solutions as well. But it has been too much presented as that. You know, for every talk that begins with graphs and diagrams and that kind of, this is the science, these are the facts, and then sort of jumps to, so you've got to do X, Y, Z. It's just not convincing for an awful lot of people because of the reaction against rationalism and experts telling us what to do. And people remember, you know, the fuel was going to run out when I was young, or, you know, oh, it's just another of those scientists telling us something apocalyptic. So unless you can get past that, I think scientism, that kind of just science, has been a huge part of the denial and the rejection of that whole issue.
Thank you. There's a really interesting question here from Tim Evans, and Tim says, do you think that the current rapid changes in values is especially acute and difficult to navigate through in the UK because of the relatively recent presence of many people from other cultural backgrounds, e.g. South Asia, which overlap to some extent with religious differences? South Asian Christians may share many more values with Muslims from Pakistan than Christians of English heritage. Values are contested, and it's not at all clear that where intellectuals lead, everyone else does follow some decades later.
Yeah, I think that the shift to a multi-faith, multicultural society in practice, not just in the law, you know, in our own experience, in our neighbours, in our friends, has had a huge influence. But I think the real influence is making you self-aware about your own values and beliefs. You can't just think like I did when I went to primary school in a Somerset village that everyone's Christian and everyone thinks like this. You can't think that anymore. It's just impossible. And that's a huge difference. I don't think, you know, I absolutely don't equate different religious or ethnic minorities with a set of values, because each one has got a whole range of values, just like the white British majority has. And they overlap in really interesting ways. So I don't see, you know, I wouldn't say that's the basis of the values pluralism, but it is the basis of us all having to be visible and articulate about what our values are, because we can't assume that everyone understands them or shares them anymore.
So, I mean, do you think there's an opportunity there for interreligious relations in a sense, in that values pluralism can fill a space that's more widely accepted across across the non-liberal traditions of all the religions in a sense, whereas religious pluralism was always more contentious for some aspects?
Oh, I think values pluralism is just as contentious, you know, and it runs through all the religions. So the liberal Hindus and Jews and Muslims and Christians have got a lot in common, and the fundamentalist ones have got a lot in common. They might not like to think that, but they have. So it ought to split things up into more interesting debates like that.
Wonderful. And there's a question related to that from SD Peters, who says, in a pluralistic society, how do we think of cohesion? Do we need social cohesion? Why are we seeing a rise in nationalisms but an increase in domestic and culture value wars? Sorry, domestic culture and value wars. How do these questions factor into this week's discussion of values?
Yes, I think that cohesion has been sort of uncritically accepted as a good thing. In political, I've yesterday illustrated how politicians fell for that really after the Cantle report on the riots in, when was it, Andrew, 2001, and thought that we've all got to strive to be cohesive. But do we have to be? What does it really mean? And as I showed with fundamental British values, when you try and do it, it can often be completely counterproductive. It can backfire. So I think we need to be, just like we need to be careful with the idea of community, we need to be careful with the idea of cohesion. Now, whose cohesion and around what, on what basis? You have to have some common things, but I'd rather see more, a better kinds of pluralism.
Yeah, I guess if cohesion becomes homogenization, then it's deeply problematic, isn't it, really? And it's a case of trying to find the continuity. So somebody else like David Savage has asked here, one way of reframing shared values could be to talk about our common humanity, for instance, which he's asking if you agree with that.
I'm not sure about that. I mean, that's a liberal humanist way of putting it. But what is our common humanity? And is that going to start excluding those of us who don't agree with that definition of what it is as well? I mean, I can see what it's getting at, but I'm not sure. It does the job well enough.
Cool. Let's flip over to RE for a couple of questions. There's a few people asking about that. For starters, Paula, the new name for RE in Wales is Religion, Values and Ethics. The public consultation on this national guidance has been published today. Perfect time. Well done, Wales. Wales has featured really prominently over the last couple of days, and this is good news. Cymru am byth. I would love to hear your views on that in the coming weeks. Are you intending to participate in the debate and consultation? Values are being included in our curriculum, but we want to get this right.
I'm absolutely aware of this. In fact, I got the new values curriculum sent me just before I finished writing this lecture about an hour ago. So I didn't have time to look at it, but I'm very excited to look at it. I'm very hopeful for this. I think Wales is being really pioneering. The RE curriculum in England is falling behind Scotland and Wales. It's not been reformed. It's not been changed. You know, RE professionals and teachers have been campaigning for change for a long time. I'm really hopeful that Wales is doing something really interesting in this new curriculum. It comes with a really important change, Andrew, which is that they're going to stop making religion an opt-out subject. You know, parents have been able to opt their children out of RE, and still can. And that's because it was assumed it would be confessional, and it would be exclusive of people who weren't Christian. But if you teach RE properly, it shouldn't be exclusive in that way. And Wales has grasped that nettle. So I'm really hopeful that Wales will be doing a great job with this, and that it will encourage English politicians to have the bottle to start to reform the English RE curriculum as well. So well done, Wales. And I hope that I can be involved, and I'd love to be involved in the way that's worked out.
Excellent. I know there are a number of RE teachers online tonight, and I'm sure they're all kind of applauding loudly from their living rooms at the moment. So Cecilia Scott has gone a slightly different route with RE there, and she says, you mentioned revising the RE curriculum, but Do we still need RE if values are the new religion? Do schools need a discrete subject to discuss values, or should values education be part of all school subject teaching and learning?
Oh, well, that's a good question. I can see what you mean, because if religion isn't, well, religion is still a subject. You've got to teach religion as well, because it's so important. I just don't think we're going to get, pragmatically, there isn't going to be time on the curriculum to have them as separate subjects, even though that might be good. But I do think school values are so important, as I illustrated. And I have heard some schools say, you can't have too much debate about if they're there for holding discipline and people together, you can't be constantly debating them, fair enough. But you can use the RE space and value space to think about where they come from and why these ones, and disagreeing for those, because a lot of my undergrads, I've been teaching ethics and values this term, are quite skeptical and critical about what happened in school with their values, because they feel bossed about and got at and not able to talk about it. So that's a long-winded way of saying I think in practice we're going to have to hold them together. There just isn't enough time or will to start a whole new subject. But hopefully the RE space can be the one for it.
So we don't need to change the name of our departments quite yet, then, would you say?
I wouldn't mind changing the name.
Let's stick with Wales for a while, and Sarah Rowland Jones from St David's Cathedral. Is vocabulary around values, and indeed what makes life worth living, getting increasingly tangled up with economic or fiscal perspectives? And is it thus susceptible to distortion from the dollar bottom line?
Yes, absolutely. I'm not sure it's getting worse, but it's absolutely been the case. And if you Google value, you'll get something about company value and economic value, and so it's just starting, I think, to broaden that out. And that was what I was trying to say about that false fundamentalism of there's only one real value, so don't argue about how we're going to organize this company, because it's all about the bottom line. But are you saying that in the BBC today? It was actually about the bottom line and the ethics didn't matter? No, we've got to think about both things and hold them together.
Another element that somebody suggests is feeding into how values are being shaped. So a question from Jeremy Rodell, who's been with us all week. Thanks for joining us, Jeremy. We've appreciated your questions. To what extent do you think that our values have been shaped by the fact that most people living in the West have enjoyed an unprecedented period without direct experience of war?
Yes, a lot, I think. So I think that's why the self-sacrificial aspect of Christian values got so emphasized, because of the world wars and that sacrifice of life. And I think that the receding from the horizon of war has had a big influence and has allowed values about kindness and gentleness and more pacifistic values really to come to the fore. And that has got tied up with women having, women's changed place and things like child rearing and care getting a higher profile as well. So it's all sort of meshed together, all part of why we're moving to a more sort of live your life and respect-based values.
There's a question from Hannah related to the move to live your life as well. So Hannah says, in yesterday's lecture, you suggested that the give your life ethic was a more Christian ethic than live your life. Is that really so? Might it not be that each ethic in its pure form reflects different aspects of Christian theology coming through at different points of British history, possibly?
No, I agree with Hannah about that. It's a great question. And the idea that it's values fundamentalism that says there's only one Christian ethic, the Christian ethic. There isn't the Christian ethic. Jesus wasn't a moral teacher. He didn't put down a set of ethics. He was much more interested than that. He gave a commentary on on actual situations. He gave a moral commentary on the actual situation, but not general rules. So I do think that the Christian ethics has got all those things, both and more in it. I mean, just take how you interpret Jesus' death on the cross. In the New Testament itself, it can be interpreted as a self-giving sacrificial act, or it can be, I can't remember which of the epistles says that Jesus goes to the cross for the joy that was set before him. There are very different ways of reading these things. So I completely agree with Hannah that a live your life ethic is compatible with Christianity and not just the give your life ethic.
We're almost out of time, sadly. So let me just come finally to this question from Mike Hill, which I really like. The interesting thing about the ethical life and values is that there aren't any people who are better at it than others, he says, quoting you back to yourself, I think. Really? Do we not all honour certain values heroes, such as Captain Tom, Mother Teresa, whilst recognising that no one is perfect?
Yes, of course we do. That's really true. But it's not that there's not a cadre of people. I mean, there's not a profession. There's not I've been trained like this, so I therefore am going to be one of those moral heroes. You know, a moral hero, the fantastic thing about moral heroes, gender inclusive, is they arise from anywhere and everywhere. And it's that I meant, it's a sort of, in that sense, none of us are, there's no qualification you're going to get that's going to guarantee that outcome.
Becoming a values hero comes from being heroic in the field of values, as opposed to from having a PhD in values studies or something like that.
It does. Andrew, can I pick up one? I don't usually look at the Q&A because that's too much all at once, but I just saw that Sarah Jane Page asked something which I think is really important, which is how can you have pluralism if there are some things negative, you know, values that are so negative that they're just going to be really destructive? I think that's what she's saying. And I think that's a really important point. I wish I'd said more about that, because I think she's absolutely right. And I think you do have to have boundaries. You know, values are ways of saying we will never do this, and we won't go beyond that boundary. And so that needs to be included in an account of pluralism. And I'm not going to do that now, but I think thank you for that challenge.
Yeah, and thanks for all your questions throughout the week, Sarah. It's been good to see you on here. We're overdue a coffee at some stage. Linda, it has been a tremendous evening. It's been a tremendous week. There are many comments in the chat, as you'll see, because we'll send them later to you, expressing a deep thanks and gratitude for you. You've really set out the topic in such an engaging and accessible way, and I've really appreciated once again the generosity of spirit as well as the critical rigour with which you've approached the issue. So thank you very much for making the time to be with us this week and for making such an important subject so accessible and helping us understand it in new and fresh ways. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you everyone who's been part of it.